If you have ever walked through downtown Floyd and found yourself all of a sudden next to a cemetery near the hotel, you probably have found yourself next to the old Jacksonville cemetery. But how many of us ask the question, why is it here? Or who is buried there? Lucky for us, Gino has asked those questions, did the research, and decided to share his knowledge with us. So join us as Gino Williams goes over the history of the Jacksonville Cemetery.
Tell you a little bit about the area when this cemetery was established. This is called the Jacksonville Cemetery. You'll see it listed as the old Jacksonville Cemetery. You'll see it listed as the Floyd Cemetery. If it had another name, it would have been called the Kitterman Cemetery, because that's what it was for about the first 20 years, because the Kitterman family actually conveyed the property over to the trustees for the public burial ground for the town of Jacksonville. The weird thing about this is that the cemetery never was located in the town of Jacksonville, okay? This place has got a weird history, and that's another long and detailed story. But the town of Jacksonville was on the side of the road with the courthouse, on both sides of Oxford Street. It never got this far. And the reason the town didn't come in this direction, the town of Jacksonville, is because of the Kitterman barn which sat between us and the road. And they didn't want to take Mr. Kitterman's barn as part of the town, so they didn't come over here with it. And so this property started out as property of David Kitterman. His house was located near the Primitive Baptist Church, the church that's above the Lush Lounge and Easy Stop on the left there. And his water came out of the spring that is the headwaters of Oldfield Creek, which is there where that big willow is behind the Lush Lounge. Okay, you know what I'm talking about? But this was his property. He owned 477 acres, went back through Stalker's or Storker's Knob, and he had all of that property when the town of Jacksonville was actually set up. Okay, this property, if you're looking at the settlement map, the patent grant map, is going to be listed under Renfro, okay? The original owner of this sort of quadrant of what is now the town of Floyd. And so that was David Kitterman's. In 1852, John Kitterman, son of David, conveyed this property over to the trustees for a public burial ground for the town of Jacksonville. And it's differentiated from the one on the hill. This is Jacksonville Cemetery. That's the Jacksonville burial ground. And that's how you differentiate them. And some of the same people, there are people buried in here that are related to people that are buried on the ground. And we'll get around to one lady whose husband is buried up there, and she's down here. Okay? It was used as a cemetery up until roughly 1888. So for about the first 50 years, you're going to see some burials in here before the town of Jacksonville got the property. But it ran from about 50 years. This is a snapshot of an antebellum community. Okay? You got to keep that in mind. And the layout of this thing, the way this fence sets, this is about where the original gate was for the cemetery. There was originally a cast iron fence around the cemetery at one point. Eventually that fell down. They ended up with a wire fence that was around it. That came down. And this was replaced by the town of Floyd, I guess, about a decade ago. Okay? This actually probably includes a little bit more space than was in the original cemetery. And if you're facing this way, to the right would have been the slave graves along, and I think they're now inside the fence row. Originally, the slave graves here were outside that fence towards Route 8. The middle of the cemetery, and we're going to go over there after a while, and that's where the Kittermans are buried. They reserved for themselves the most important spot in the property. And as we go in, we're going to go down now to my left. We're going to go around and sort of wander around, and I'm going to talk about some of the people that are here, and we're going to end up over at Nathaniel Henry's stone, cenotaph. You know what's a cenotaph? There's no body there, because he was buried in a pauper's grave, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And I'll tell you a little story. I think we're pretty close to where the body is, but we'll talk about that story in a minute, because that's a story between me and Worth Lucas, and we'll get to that in a minute. This is a table stone, okay? It's fairly rare, and this marks the grave of a 2-year-old girl. Isabel Hayden, H-E-A-D-E-N. Now you'll see it modernized to Hayden in a lot of places now, but this is her grave. This tombstone, actually underneath all this moss, is carved all with initials and little statements and everything else of people who used to come down here over the last 150 years and carve this stone up. The damage to this stone was done by a tractor trailer that backed up before all this work was done, backed up here and hit this stone. It's eventually got to be replaced, but it's probably going to require a crane because it's very delicate. But this stone was put here in 1844 to mark the grave of Isabel Hayden. And I wanted to bring you down here first because I want to tell you about what this cemetery was. This is the closest thing to a park that the people in antebellum Floyd had, okay? They would visit here and have picnics here and do all kinds of things here because they treated cemeteries differently in that time period than we do today. If you think about on top of the hill at the burial ground, they've got that gazebo there. They used to play music on Sundays there all the time. It was a place people went. They went because a lot of the people here died very young. There are a lot of kids buried in this cemetery. A lot of children buried in this cemetery. They didn't live a long life. There's a lot of 30-something adults that are buried in here. And so what they would do is they would come have picnics. They would meet around the graves of their ancestors and their children and their descendants. And they would sit there and they would sort of have a communion with them, if you will. But they used it as a park. And a table stone like this a lot of times was used to lay the picnic out on. Okay? We don't think about things like that, but that was one of the uses of this kind of stone. And her father, James B. Hayden, was one of the first trustees. He would have lived in Glen Anna at one point. Okay? The other thing you're going to find out about a lot of these people in this cemetery, they were all related. A lot of them were related because they grew up here, they intermarried here, their children intermarried here, and they were buried here, and they stayed here. And so this is the first spot. I wanted to bring you down here and show you, the damage is what it is. I'm surprised it probably hasn't come down. But it's going to require a crane probably to lift it back up to protect it, to make sure if it's ever repaired. But one day when these stones are cleaned, and they do need to eventually be cleaned, you'll see all this stuff underneath it. But she was buried in 1844. She was born in 1842. She was buried in this cemetery when it was the Kitterman Cemetery before the town of Jacksonville got it. If you'll notice down here, you're going to find there are all kinds of graves in this cemetery that aren't marked. There used to be field stones all over this cemetery that marked graves. Those field stones at some point were picked up and they were deposited along what was a wire fence along through there. And they were there in 1979 when I first got to push mow this cemetery for the town, when I worked for the town. Those stones were all taken up by Hugh Rakes when Hugh was building a garage that's sitting under the parking lot down there and dumped in the ground. And while I assume they were taken up to make it easier to clean the cemetery. That's usually what they did. So you're going to find lots of graves, and you're going to be able to see them where the indentations are, where there's been a little bit of collapse. And one of the reasons we don't come back in here and fill this grass has native grasses in it that don't exist anywhere else in the county. When John Shoulders came over here from Virginia Tech, Jim Castile brought him in to take a look at it when the trustees at the burial ground took over as trustees here and had him look at this, and he said, don't touch the grass. That's why we don't come in here and do anything to try to clean that up. This was probably the upper middle class, if you will, merchants, business people that were here in this town. Okay, if you think about it, this is the only town in the county. Most of the rest of the county is farmland. The blacksmiths and the saddlers and all those types of people were here. And they actually made a little bit. Talk a little bit when we get around to it to one of the gentlemen, and we'll talk about the values and the change after the war, about how the affluence changed in terms of their values and things. But that's what I think this was. Right now, these stones in here, these are the earliest burials in the cemetery. This is John Kitterman, okay? John is the original, the guy that conveyed the property to the town, to the trustees as a burial ground. He is not buried up with his father, who is buried right in the middle. David is buried over in the middle of the cemetery, and we'll get around to his grave. This is the earliest marked grave that we know of, though my guess is there are going to be graves in here that were marked by stones as early as about 1812, about the time the area was being settled. They're going to be Kitterman children, probably, because there was nothing else here. This whole area was empty. This was a compromise in 1832 to set the town here, okay? So the only reason there's a cemetery here is because they fought over Spangler's Mill and Falling Branch as a place for the county seat, and they compromised because the court told them, if you don't do it, I'm going to put you in jail. So they finally had to settle on a place, and this is how it ended up here. So this cemetery is an accident. It would have stayed a family cemetery, and it would have been very small. So anyway, this way. You're going to see throughout this cemetery these white stones, these whiter stones. Those are Confederate veterans, okay? Now we're going to go around in a minute up to Ferdinand Winston's tombstone, and we're going to talk about him in some detail. But when you walk through here, you're going to notice that there are the crosses are with them, the Confederate crosses of honor that are that have been put up by the Daughters of the Confederacy. And they mark graves of Confederate veterans throughout the cemetery. And we're going to talk about some of them as we go. The gentleman that's behind this bush here, you're going to see his marker. The bigger the marker, the more money there were. Again, it's an affluence thing. And you're going to notice these stones, they were scratched into at one point, but you can barely read them now. They need to be cleaned. They need to be etched and all kinds of things to verify. Because when they came through here in the 1930s and did the first study with the WPA, they were not able to read a lot of these stones. And a lot of the records they've got, if you go online and you look that up, you're going to get misspellings and everything that they picked up off the stones. So take everything with a grain of salt when you go through there and do that. Captain Dobbins is one of three brothers who were captains in the Confederate Army. There's Armistead, there's Abner, and there's Thomas P. Okay, and I think Thomas P's stone is the one back there. And this is their fathers in the midst of these trees, Samuel Russell Dobbins. Captain Dobbins, and I have to get to my notes because all three brothers start to tangle me up sometimes. He was in charge of the 42nd Virginia after Henry Lane died at Cedar Mountain. And we're going to talk about Henry Lane in a minute. But he was a storekeeper. He was a businessman. He died at the age of 37. His brother Armistead, who is buried in here, was one of the Immortal 600, who was under the guns in Charleston Harbor when the Union took 600 soldiers down there and put them under the guns while they were attempting to take the fort and take Wilmington Harbor. Armistead is one of three members of the Immortal 600 that were from Floyd. J.W. Helms, who was a captain, William Henry Morgan, W.H. Morgan, who had a law office here in town, who moved here after the war, was part of that. And so Abner is a brother of that. But I wanted to point him out because he's one of three brothers who were captains. Very prominent family. You're not going to see that spelling much anymore. But they were business people here. Samuel was a storekeeper. The brothers were all storekeepers and cattle farmers and everything else. This is Harvey G. Prophet. I think that G stands for green. Occasionally you'll find in the prophet line, you'll find the name Green Prophet. This is the first prophet that came to Floyd. This is the father of Joseph Patterson Prophet. He was actually a Franklin County soldier during the war. He moved here after the war. They were business people. They had a store here in town. Family was very prominent up through the 1940s, I guess into the early 1950s. And I guess Miss Nancy Sheeler, I guess, was the last one, she was the last of the family that lived here, I think. But anyway, he was in, I think, Company G, the 56th Virginia, I think is what he was in. But anyway, he's a very prominent again. But the reason I'm stopping here are these two small stones behind. This is Callahill M. Stiegelman and Mary Stiegelman. but it's not the Callaheel Stiegelman that he's buried up on top of the hill, okay? I don't know, I can't find out, but I think these are his children. He had 3 children that survived the war, but I think these are 2 that didn't, that were born after the war. Actually, I guess Waitman was 59. But anyway, these 2 children, and I can't find them, okay? But again, you're going to find all these little children born, you know, they didn't survive. The death rate for these kids was tremendous in those days. A lot of them are buried without headstones. And again, this has to do with the affluence of the people. They would mark their kids' graves with these stones. But if you ever run across that and you find me some proof that these are Callaheel Stiegelman's children, I'd love to know it. I mean, you know, when I'm out here doing the research for this cemetery, I've got all kinds of questions and things that I've got in my own mind. That's why I've got this little notebook with me, because I'm taking notes all the time to try to figure it out. But I think those are Callaheel Stiegelman's, and he was a very, very important part of Floyd post-war. He set up the education system here. He did all of that. He was his first school superintendent. He was a doctor. He was captain. He was I guess, Company A of the 24th Virginia. And so he lived in town. And these are probably 2 of his children. I assume this is Callaheel Jr. who is there, but I can't prove that. This is the grave area of Ferdinand A. Winston, okay? You'll notice there's no Confederate marker on him. The reason there's no Confederate marker is that he was probably, most likely, a member of the Society of Heroes of America. That would have been, as they would have seen it here in Floyd, disloyal to the Confederate government. He became a sheriff during Reconstruction. He's buried all the way here, out here at the end of the cemetery, I think on purpose. There's no other reason for him not to have been buried in a more prominent place. This is his wife. They've got a daughter here. His mother and father are both buried in here. But he is buried here, I think, and without, you know, much of a marker. He actually is listed on a Confederate roll, but he was taken prisoner by the Confederate government. He was arrested and taken to Castle Thunder, which was the prison in Richmond, interrogated over his disloyalty to the Confederate government. He was released because they couldn't prove it. But he has sort of been treated as an outcast. If you'll notice, he's completely outside what would have been the edges of this cemetery. Make of it what you will. You know, that's something you'll never be able to prove or never be able to show. He is probably the reason that the first Masonic Lodge busted up in Floyd. He was a member of the Masonic Lodge, as were a lot of these veterans. And I think, though I can't, again, the records are not there, I think the schism that occurred between the Confederate veterans and Confederate sympathizers and some of the people that were disloyal, because this was a Union area right up to the time the war opened, when Lincoln called for troops. And we're going to go see Hervey Deskin's tomb in a minute. We'll talk about him. But this was a Union area. And I think in November, I think you're going to get a little bit of that when Sheila El-Rodani talks about, in our program, talks about the Brethren in Virginia and how they were anti-slavery and were very much opposed to secession. So if you get a chance, there's the plug for the November program. But anyway, if you've got questions about Ferdinand Winston, I'll be glad to try to answer them. But he was a member of the Society of Heroes of America. They wore a red string to be able to be identified. It is believed that he, with Callaheel Stiegelman, surrendered the town. My guess is that he is the reason they didn't burn the town in 1865 when Stoneman came through here. I think had it been one of the others, J.E. Rollins, one of the others that had actually surrendered the town, I think they may have burned the town. That's what they were doing with a lot of these Confederate towns. But my guess is that he probably saved the town, though after the war and things started to be rewritten and there was a huge tale going on about things, I think they had a big split, and that's why he's buried here. The only thing that I can go on is the arrest of him and taking him to Castle Thunder. I have seen other things that lead me to believe it's correct. There's the reason I say supposedly. I have to hedge everything, and as I've told Janet many times, there's not a day goes by that if I find a document or something, it doesn't change my opinion of what was going on here. History gets rewritten. I mean, the whole post-war thing gets rewritten, and that's not necessarily a good thing. The truth actually is more important at the end of the day than that, because we don't want to go back and repeat everything. And when you make stuff up and when you change the history, you tend to want to repeat it. And I can't, and looking back at it, I can't really be negative about him being anti. My kids asked me one time, what would you do if you had been living at the time? And I said, I've got abolitionists in my family history on my grandmother Thompson's side. More than likely, though, living in Floyd, I'd have been pro-Confederate. I mean, that's what it would have been. Now, looking back at it, I'm absolutely saying, no, absolutely not. You don't do that. That would have been wrong. Slavery was wrong. But at the time, he stood up for something he believed in, and I really can't knock him for that. You'd like to think you'd been able to do that, but the reality is that most people couldn't do that. It's one of the reasons that so many people ended up not fighting and deserting and leaving the Confederate Army from around here. There were a lot of brethren, and again, I don't want to get into that. That's another program. But there are a lot of brethren that refused to fight and hid out in these mountains because they didn't believe in fighting, number one, and they didn't believe in slavery, number two. So again, when we rewrite history to make it look better, I mean, how many of your ancestors really wanted to admit that was what they were fighting for? As a reality, that just isn't that, I was pro-slavery, so we get into that. We get in a huge debate about it, and we discuss it all. So this is Mary Russell Rowland. And I told you this is one of the things that when I'm digging through these cemeteries, you find people that you hadn't thought about, maybe you need to know a little bit more about. She was big in the temperance movement, okay? This stone was actually placed by Jacksonville Lodge No. 1 of the Temperance Union movement when she died. It's one of the later burials in this cemetery. And of course, this is another one of those stones that needs to be put up off the ground. I don't know a lot about her. They had several temperance meetings here. They had several temperance parades here. But she apparently was big because this is the only time I've ever seen a reference to this Jacksonville Lodge No. 1 of the Temperance Union. And she died in 1886, so that tells you how early this Temperance Union movement was in Floyd. Okay? Anybody knows anything about her? Let me know, because I'm going to dig into her background, but I've never seen her name before until I got to working a little bit deeper in this cemetery. And my connection to this cemetery goes back to 1979. I used to come through here as a kid, but when I worked for the town, I got to mow this a lot. That was one of the things. Rick Lewis would leave and tell me and Glenn to come mow. So that's what we do. And you'll notice this stone's actually marked. This came out of Withville. And it's sort of ornate, so that tells you that somebody took time and wanted to do that. But it is marked Jacksonville Lodge No. 1 up here at the top. This is James Madison Matt Howard. Now, he lived in town in the brick building there below Chicks that we call the Weeks House, okay, with the Indian statue that's been carved in front of it. So this is James Madison. He is one of 2 soldiers that were killed in Floyd County in battle, or at least in the military, okay? Now, I will tell you something, and I try not to do this in front of family members of Mr. Howard because there's still some around. He had issues. He wasn't all right, and I don't know whether it was PTSD. You can't go back and do medical diagnoses on people, but he had issues. He and 14 other members of the Home Guard went, and he, pretty much by himself, attacked Stoneman's columns near Willis and was killed by Union troops when Stoneman came through here in April of 1865. Okay? He was a lieutenant. He served about a year in the Confederate service. And again, he had issues. He had a slave with him by the name of Wise Hedden, who was probably owned by some of the Hedden family that's in that first grave we talked about, who actually recovered the body and brought it back to Floyd. The other 14 people thereabouts with him left and did not attack Stoneman's columns, which I guess had about 3,000 troops when they came through that original column. And they ran up into Pleasant Hill Cemetery and hid. But he was the only Confederate killed in Floyd during the war. The second soldier that was killed during the war was buried in this cemetery, but he's not here now. A Union soldier got drunk when they were camped out down the field from the museum, okay, out at the Ridgemont, that field down through there. Stoneman's troops were down in that field. They were camped. That little white house that's now a tattoo shop was the last house in town at the time. And this soldier who was drunk, and there was tons of rye whiskey around, the one thing they kept making during the war was rye whiskey. They made a lot of it. But he was pretty well intoxicated. He went up to his commanding officer. He got into it with him. He turned his back, and the officer shot him somewhere down that hill. He was brought into this in 1865 and buried here. Sometime in the early part of the 20th century, they came back and dug him up. The entire town turned out. Okay? And this story came from Joe Cundiff's mom, who lived here in town. Because she was here, hanging onto the fence. They were all wanting to see what was left of that Yankee. Few buttons. You know, the body had decomposed, and of course he was probably buried without a real casket or coffin of any kind. So that was all that was left of him. They dug him up, and they removed him to Stanton. And I'm going to leave it to you all. I'm going to leave it to you all to dig up who he was. That's sort of the test for the day. If you want to do anything extra, you're going to do that. I'm not going to give you the name and all that. You dig that up. But he was removed from here and moved up to Stanton. So those were the soldiers that were killed during the war. We get around here, and we've got three people I want to point out. Major Henry Lane. This monument was put up by the Masonic Lodge here in Floyd after he was killed and after the war. He died in 1862 at the Battle of Cedar Mountain. He was shot in line of battle. He was in command of the 42nd Virginia at the time. And he had left here as captain of the Company B of the 42nd Virginia. I think, it's got Major listed, I think he was breveted in the field, though he died before he ever got his commission as a colonel. My guess is he probably, had he survived, would have ended up being a brigadier general in the Army. Anyway, Major Lane died there in command of the 42nd Virginia. He was buried here. He was Commonwealth's attorney here in Floyd at the beginning of the war when he left to lead Company B of the 42nd out. He was he and a Shields gentleman were the creators and publishers of the Floyd Intelligencer, which was the first newspaper in Floyd. If you get our history newspaper now, that's why it's called the Floyd Intelligencer, because it's named after the original newspaper here, if anybody had a question about that. But he was a publisher, very prominent gentleman, very important gentleman in the community. You know, he was one of those people that thought we're going to go out and fight one battle, the war's going to be over. And of course, you know, he ends up getting killed. Behind him, you're going to see Henry Dillon. That marker is a memorial to them. The whole Dillon family is buried back here. Henry is the one that you see all these brick buildings built in town, these old brick buildings. Glen Anna, the house across the street, the Weeks house, the Presbyterian church that's now the Masonic Lodge. All those old brick buildings were built by Henry Dillon. And so he's buried in here. His son John, who is buried to my left as we face this stone, was killed at Mine Run. He was a Confederate soldier. He was a doctor. Again, you're looking at the middle class of Floyd that went out and fought, and that's who's buried in this cemetery. So let's go this way. To my left now, is one of the two Methodist preachers buried in here that married. This is L.W. Thompson. I don't know a lot about him, but he was a Methodist preacher. There's a Peter Shelburne buried in here as well. For whatever reason, Methodist preachers tended to marry Floyd girls, and two of them ended up buried in this cemetery. Again, they were real young. If you'll notice a lot of these things, if you see somebody in their 50s or older, they lived a long time in this era, in this environment. But anyway, L.W. Thompson is a preacher. This is the Kitterman part that I talked about. This is where the Kittermans are buried. But I wanted to point out these graves down here. The last grave down here at the end is listed as Harvey Deskins. Now, Harvey Deskins was a long-time member of the House of Delegates. He was a circuit court clerk here in Floyd and a signer of the Articles of Secession. But what I want to point out to you is that Harvey wasn't his name. This stone, which spells it on his daughter's grave as Hervey, H-E-R-V-Y, is correct. This is how come you got to be a little bit careful when you're going through and studying stones. They spelled it right here because he was still alive. After he died, they went back to calling him Harvey. He wasn't Harvey Deskins. But he was a really important person here in Floyd in terms of the community. He was a member of the state senate for a term. I think he was a 5 or 6 term member of the House of Delegates. He was a delegate at the Articles at the Secession Convention in 1861. He was opposed to secession till Lincoln called for troops. There's a letter in the archives that talks about how he wrote back to Callowhill Stiegelman and told him, "I'll be the last person to go for secession down here." But the moment Lincoln called for troops, the entire convention turned, and he ended up signing those articles, and he's buried in here. And again, you'll notice the condition of the stones. Some of this stuff needs to be fixed up. That's where we're at. This has been the last stone, obviously, put up in this cemetery, and this is a memorial to Nathaniel Henry. And the reason it's here is because we don't know where he was buried. He's buried in a pauper's grave. He was a school teacher here. His family lived down in Leakesville, North Carolina. And we don't know why they were separated. I'm sure there's a story. He has Winstons and Goodsons in his family line. And there may be some connection about why he was here in Floyd. He could be related to the Winstons over there. And he could be related to the Goodsons who lived down and are buried down at Pine Creek. But anyway, he was a pauper. He got sick and lingered, okay? He probably died of heart disease. He swelled up. I mean, he had retained a lot of fluid. It's probably heart disease, but he died, and when they put him in the hotel room, they thought he was going to die almost immediately, but he didn't. And he lingered, and he lingered, and he lingered. By the time he died, all his assets were gone, and he had to be buried here in a pauper's grave. And the only reference I've got as to where he was buried is from Marguerite Tice, who got it from her aunt, who got it probably from some story that she got from her family, that he was buried to the right of the gate. The gate's about in the right place. So when we came in here to mark this, the Daughters of the American Revolution placed this with assistance from Red Hill, Patrick Henry's home place. And I came over and took a guess. The reason I wanted to end with this is that I marked this spot being the most likely place, or as close to the grave as I can get. They brought Worth Lucas in, who was a witcher, and you all know what that is, okay? So they brought Luke Worth in. They took my marker up, and they let Worth have at it. And he got within about that far from where my mark had been in the ground. So we're pretty sure we're close to where he's buried. You'll notice, having Nathaniel Henry in here, tells you a little bit about the community. This was a very vibrant place during antebellum times. It was a huge crossroad. We don't think about it today. Lots of people traveled through here. During the summertime, you had people coming from all over. There were all kinds of little bed and breakfast, hotels, all kinds of things that were going on here. Can you think why they were here in the summer? No air conditioning. So they'd come up here because it's 15 degrees cooler. So there was a lot more traffic through here that way than there was, and we don't think about that. The records at the Masonic Lodge, we're going through and you see people from Florida and South Carolina. They traveled here, not the other way around. You know, you'd go to Florida in the wintertime maybe, if you were wealthy enough to travel and do that, as the Stiegelmans did at one point. But, you know, you did that. So we had a lot of people coming through here. This cemetery is really important.